Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm going to walk you through government policies as they relate to Northern Territories for Canada. So my presentation is one perspective to kind of give you an idea of the challenges faced by the Northern Territories, which include Yukon, Nunavut, and the Northwest Territories. A little bit about myself. I've got 25 years of experience in academia, industry, financial solutions. I run my own YouTube channel that you're more than welcome to go out and watch some of my other videos that discuss policies or economic trends. So my agenda is I'll talk about GDP, I'll talk about TIF, and I'll talk about the territories themselves, and I'll even give you a kind of outlook of some of the challenges they're faced. If you look at the territories in terms of their GDP, they're very small in terms of the overall GDP contribution when you get into basically Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. Well, population-wise, they might be 120,000 people that live in that area. And geographically, it's challenged because there's a lot of remote communities, there's lack of roads, and just everything has to be flown in. And the development of any sort of resources in is very expensive just because of the infrastructure required to get things out of the mine and get it to market. So it's something to bear in mind when you're looking at trends. Now, the government of Canada created a territorial funding financing for the territories, because remember, there's a bucket of revenue that comes into the federal government, and part of what it does is it reallocates that revenue out to provinces. And we see with equalization, we see with Canadian social transfer, we see with the health transfer as well. So we see different things of funding. The territory formula is another way the government says, you know what, we're going to give the territories money because they don't have the capacity to generate the revenue to support the same programs that would exist in basically British Columbia, Ontario. So that comes into play. Second thing, it's expensive because of the way communities are isolated, so they put in different programs to support things from food to water treatment to different things to help those communities be sustainable. Now this gives you an idea from each province. So for example, Yukon gets about 900 million as part of the TIFs. So the overall funding they're getting from the federal government is about almost $1 billion. You look at the Northwest Territories, they're getting close to $1.2 billion in funding, and a bulk of that's coming from the TIF. You look at Nunavut, it's getting about $1.5 billion in terms of transfers. Okay, so you can see that when you look at the government's finances and you look at Nunavut here, the bulk of all the government's money is coming from the federal government. It has corporations it runs, it has mining revenues from royalty that it gets, but they're not significant a portion of that budget, so they rely on the federal government to support it. So if the federal government makes any sort of cuts to the TIF fund or cuts any sort of transfer, that'll impact Nunavut's ability to offer services or support its operations. In this particular case, you're seeing that the federal government's reduced the transfer down a little bit, and that transfer reduced down has forced them into more of a deficit position, and you're seeing that in that particular case. Yukon itself, if you look here on the trend line, is they've been running surpluses the last few years. So what it tells you about there is they've taken government money, they've shown fiscal restraint, they've supported programs, but they've been very careful how they spend money to make sure that their budgets are sustainable. Now the Yukon's a little different than the Northwest Territories, and even with Nunavut, is because they have a lot of communities that are connected by roads. They don't fly in a lot of food and processes or goods and services. They don't fly in as much because they're not required, because they have road access in most cases. When you get into the Northwest Territories and you get into Nunavut, a lot of those communities are isolated, so the only way to get the goods and services in there is either fly it in or use container ships during the summer periods to load everything up. And that's the key issue here that you're dealing with, and that's why it's expensive up there. Now there's processes in play, and I'll get into more specifically as we move forward to it, but to discuss it a little bit more in terms of the economic policies and some of the things that are being considered there. This is the Northwest Territories. It shows you a little bit what's going on there. Again, they're talking about operational surplus. It's another thing just to bear in mind as well. Now let's talk about the North in general. and it's a huge area. It's rich in resources. It's not the fact that it's rich in resources is the problem. It's the infrastructure around to get the goods out of the market. Now, the northern territories, especially Nunavut and as well as Northwest Territories, have key product. For example, iron ore, nickel, rare metals, and diamonds. These are critical metal products that are required as part of the overall supply chain. But the issue is getting them to market. And you'll see significant investments been made in terms of opening up new diamond mines. There's a big Baffin Island iron ore project is on the ground still. You're seeing these projects come to full blown, even gold and silver mines. And there's cases where, for example, in Cambridge Bay, where the actual mining company, as part of the legacy, is building the infrastructure around. So in other words, they're building the cell towers. They're building roads around there as part of the legacy around that they'll leave the communities. The other thing too is the mining companies themselves hire First Nation, so a bulk of those employees are First Nation. They take that money, put it back into their communities. So that's all part of the overall strategy. The second point that's coming into play more and more is roads. For example, the previous government is building a highway from Nunavut to Tukatoyak, so that opens up the north there. That's one of the key issues that the governments want to do, is allow more road access and more ability to move goods, so they're not relying on ice roads. So that's in play. We also have a bridge that was built connecting Yellowknife over the Mackenzie River. In the past, the only way you could do it is through barge traffic in the spring and summer, and then ice roads in the winter to move things. Well, they wanted a permanent road access. That makes it easier to move goods in and less expensive, because Yellowknife's the hub for the Northwest Territories for goods and services to come out. There's been considerable expansion and money put into port development in areas like Pond Inlet, Cambridge Bay, Rankin Inlet, as well as Iqaluit, to help develop those things to get goods into key hubs to help them better distribute those products. Okay, so the North has its challenges, and it's like right, wrong, or indifferent, it's always will have those challenges. But it's up to federal government, provincial governments, and even the municipal government level to decide and prioritize how they're going to bring in sustainable growth to support those communities being self-sustaining. You know, they still go live off the land. They're still doing the caribou hunts. They're still doing their fishing and all that. They still live off the land. But there has to be other processes in play to help them better be more sustainable and self-sufficient government. And you're seeing that more. They're giving more control to Denega government to be self-control. Okay, so that's good. But as long as you have oversight and accountability, that's critical to drive that. So many people don't necessarily understand the North, and it is an interesting area. It is also complicated because you get into Norman Wells, where the oil and gas sector is good, because there has been talk about moving a pipeline up the Mackenzie River to Nunavut to Tukatoyak area to allow for more expansion out there. So there's all talk about economic growth. I support sustainable economic growth, always have. I also support partnerships with First Nations, okay, provinces, municipalities, to make sure the wealth is shared. I also support environmental assessments. What I don't support is activists going out there to shut things down for their own hidden agenda. Canada depends on resources. We need to get the resources to market to bring that economic growth. The North would benefit tremendously if we could find ways to open it up, allow more opportunity up there. And that's the key thing that I wanted to touch base with and leave this presentation on. We need to be asking questions of our politicians. What is your agenda to move the economy forward in all aspects of this country? Not just Ontario, not just Quebec, all aspects including the North. Thank you.